Hello readers, welcome to Planet Fantasy, where we talk about fantasy, science fiction, horror, and speculative fiction. Bonus episodes will feature shows and movies and anything else that I want to talk about. I am your host Moses, and before we get started, if you're watching me on YouTube, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. And if you're tuning into the podcast, subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any new releases. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the show, all of you metal eaters. Today I'm talking about the 2006 novel, Mistborn, The Final Empire, written by the biggest name in fantasy right now, Mr. Brandon Sanderson. So I'll go over why I read this book, who Brandon Sanderson is, for the few of you who don't know who he is. I'll cover how the book came to be, what the process looked like, and then talk about the plot spoilers, as always. Then we'll talk about the lore of the in-book universe, and then my final thoughts on the work. So I read this book, Mistborn, because it was listed as one of the best starting points for Brandon Sanderson's works. It was published early in his career, and it is the first of a fantasy trilogy that was listed as having a very unique magic system. Now, my own experience with Brandon Sanderson before reading Mistborn, I had read the first 3 books of Stormlight Archive, which I will cover in different episodes. I had read those 3 books several years previously, but I wanted to try some different flavors from his other works because, to be honest, I really bogged down in the 4th Stormlight Archive book, The Rhythm of War. And so I let a few years pass there, and I decided to check out something else. And so the first time I heard of Brandon Sanderson was a conversation I was having with a friend, actually about the Wheel of Time series. And for those of you who do not know, it's one of the most popular fantasy sagas ever put to paper. And the reason that Sanderson's name came up in that conversation is because he's actually the one that finished the Wheel of Time series, even though he was not the original author. The OG author of Wheel of Time was Robert Jordan, and he passed away before he could actually finish the 14-book series. But Brandon was brought on to conclude the work, and so he ended up writing the final 3 books, I believe. And so this is also when I was told that Brandon was actually a better author than Robert Jordan, and that I should read his book called The Way of Kings. I was told that this was a much less boring series than The Wheel of Time, and I get that people have their opinions about Wheel of Time and at what point in the series they believe that the series became less interesting, but at that time, when I had that conversation, I just so happened to be in the slog portion of those books. A lot of fans talk about the slog through the Wheel of Time series, and I mean, if you have a 14-book series, you know, I want to be gracious and say, well, that's liable to happen to some people. So I eventually did just that. I read The Way of Kings during COVID, and I was blown away. I was blown away by The Way of Kings. I can't wait to cover it here, but I was really stunned by how complex the story was, and yet his writing was so accessible. And so I felt that since I was losing steam on the Wheel of Time, I wanted something that was still fantasy, but not as high fantasy as Wheel. Although I do remember hesitating at first because I was told that the magic of The Way of Kings, and therefore Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, I was told that the magic there was mostly bound to weapons and armor. And that's very different from the kind of magic I historically like reading about in fantasy. You know, it's the classic Dungeons and Dragons type magic. But I ended up trying it, read the book very quickly, really liked his writing, and I wanted to go back and try Mistborn, see what his earlier works were like, and so here we are. So who is Brandon Sanderson? Born in 1975 in Lincoln, Nebraska, Brandon was the eldest of several children, and he graduated high school in 1994. Studied biochemistry at BYU, Brigham Young, during which he took 2 years to do Mormon missionary work. Also, I realize that when I do these live summary segments that I am effectively reducing a person or an author down to just 2 or 3 sentences. Obviously, a person is not that simple and cannot be defined by where they were born or where they went to school or even their most famous book. I'm just including this sort of information because I believe that readers should know the broad context of the authors that they read. Because great stories or even bad stories don't emerge from a vacuum. And I've found in my personal experience that knowing just a little bit about an author's personal life, it helps me appreciate certain elements of their art in a deeper way. So that sidebar is free. Anyway, after Brandon finished his missionary work in South Korea, he returned to BYU. He changed his studies to English, and he eventually got a master's with an emphasis in creative writing, or at least he worked on a master's with an emphasis in creative writing. And he also worked on a newspaper magazine connected with BYU. Well, not newspaper, but a speculative fiction magazine associated with BYU. And in 2006, the same year that Mistborn was released, he was married. And to this day, I believe he currently lives in Utah. And so before I get directly into talks about Mistborn, I really want to drive home just how popular Sanderson is at the moment. He has this very large following on social media. He has numerous bestsellers in both adult and young adult fiction. His name is a staple on many fantasy book subreddits. And last year, I found this fascinating. He had the most successful Kickstarter campaign of all time. Wait till you hear about this. He started the campaign with the goal of $1 million. And the purpose of that was so that he could self-publish 4 novels that he apparently wrote during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you won't believe how this turned out. So his original goal was $1 million. But within 30 days, he had crowdsourced over $41 million. $41 million. It was funded by 185,000 people, which means that the average contribution was around $220, if my math is correct, which there's a chance it may not be. And this was actually not the first time he had crowdfunded. That was back in 2020. He raised $6.7 million from 30,000 people. And the goal of that initial crowdfunding Kickstarter was to produce a leather-bound 10th anniversary edition of the Way of Kings book. And so there's a strategy here. He uses the donor funds like pre-orders, and the donors who donate beyond certain goals, the promise was that they would receive certain exclusives. And I remember seeing his initial posts about the secret projects, is what he called them. I saw those on his Instagram. But it's absolutely mind-blowing to me that he raised that much money, $41 million, which really speaks to his popularity, right? And the faith that his fans have placed in him to produce good art. That helps. That's helpful to know when looking at his books. And one more tidbit of information that I wanted to give you about Sanderson is that he is very engaged with his audience. If you go to his website, you will see that he makes public the process he is currently making on his unfinished works. Right now, it shows that his secret project number 4, the draft is complete, and that he is almost finished with Stormlight number 5. And I really appreciate this about him because there is angst in the fantasy readership about becoming emotionally invested in these large literary projects that just seem to stall before they are concluded. Of course, regular fantasy readers know the 2 series I'm about to reference, 2 current examples. The first one is obviously Game of Thrones by George Martin, and then the second series is the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Fans have been waiting on George Martin to finish the 6th Game of Thrones book the series is technically called A Song of Ice and Fire, or A Song of Fire and Ice, one of the two. They've been waiting on him to finish the 6th book in that series, The Winds of Winter, for years now. I think the last published book was called A Dance of Dragons, and it was released in 2011. That's almost 13 years ago, which is crazy because I was working in a bookstore when that was released, and that was forever ago. And people feel the same way about Patrick Rothfuss. His Name of the Wind, that's what it's called. Name of the Wind and its sequel were very popular. But there is a lot of frustration from the author and his publisher because for whatever reason, he seems to be stuck. That final trilogy book seems to be stuck in some sort of limbo. And keep in mind, this was a series that Patrick began writing in the 90s, which is around the same time as George Martin. And he actually renamed his series The Kingkiller Chronicle because its original name was called The Song of Flame and Thunder, which is very close to the name of the Game of Thrones series, Song of Fire and Ice. And so Patrick is a contemporary, in a way, of George Martin, even though he's younger. But he has not published the works as quickly as his fans had hoped. And I think that's a double-edged sword, right? Because it means that you are dealing with that pressure, but it also means that people really love your work. And so with all of that context, you can see why Sanderson is making his book progress public, especially since the Stormlight Archive series is supposed to have 10 books, and he is now on number 5. You know, that's the kind of planning that you plan your life around. You have to estimate the amount of time you think you will be alive and schedule your life around your book writing schedule. And I think that sort of dedication is very admirable. And so just check out his website, brandonsanderson.com, if you want to see it. Nobody wants to commit to a series that they don't believe will have a good ending or an ending at all. And so this is a great move on Sanderson's part. The book itself, Mistborn, is the first of a trilogy, and he says that he had 2 main ideas for the story. The first is that he wanted a heist, like Ocean's 11, and 2, he wanted the good guys in some way to lose. And so here is his official description on the website. Quote, "A heist story about a young woman recruited into a gang of thieves, trained to use magic and to imitate a noblewoman, then used in a plot to try and rob and hopefully overthrow the immortal emperor of the world. 1 part Ocean's 11, 1 part Lord of the Rings, 1 part Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, 1 part My Fair Lady," end quote. Sanderson wanted to create a character-driven work, and that does come through in the final product, although he is aware that what primarily sets the book apart is that unique magic system. So what is the magic system in Mistborn? So there are supernatural abilities that look like traditional magic, but I don't think it is actually called magic in the book, but instead it's called allomancy. So it works this way in story, and remember, I'm only speaking to what I know from the first book, so I'm sure there is more to be learned in the next 2 books. So be patient with me if you already know the system better than I do. So there exists in the world of Scadrial, that's the name of this, I don't know if it's a planet or a nation or just the world or what, but there exists knowledge of 10 different metals and their 10 corresponding alloys. So for those who need a refresher in metallurgy, I got you. I had to look it up too. An alloy is a substance composed of a metal plus another substance, sometimes another metal or some other element. So we don't get lost in the weeds. For example, we have iron, which is a metal, and steel, which is iron plus carbon. So in a way, iron is the father and steel is the son. That's how I think of the metal, and the alloys. So the same is true for tin and pewter, with tin as the father and pewter as the son. So in book 1, the population of this world knows of 10 of these type of pairings, 10 metals and their 10 alloys. There is also a legendary 11th metal, but few people know anything about that. So the way that the magic works is that the metals are eaten, yes, that's right, swallowed through the mouth, and that allows the consumer to wield different types of supernatural abilities. Not everyone can do this, though. Only certain people in the world, known as allomancers, have inherited the ability through their genetics. And they can only usually utilize one type of metal and its corresponding alloy. So, for example, some allomancers can use iron and its corresponding alloy, steel, but nothing else, while others can use tin and pewter, but nothing else. So they basically only have one super ability. But an even smaller number of people in this population are called Mistborn, and they can use all of the metals, which turns them basically into these Swiss Army knives. They're very dangerous individuals. So it's like a member of the X-Men that has all of the powers and not just one specific power. Now, the setting, the world, is not a traditional high fantasy area. Even though the official description claims that it is part Lord of the Rings, I don't really see that as an accurate description. I'd instead say that it was closer to something like Industrial Revolution England or Prussia, since there is in the world advanced use of metal and industrial technology, maybe between the 1700s and the late 1800s of our real world experience. Most of the story takes place in urban environments, and that's another strike in my mind against the Lord of the Rings descriptor, which is mostly rural. The main city of this book is called Luthadel, and so it's dystopian. Ash is continuously raining down from the sky, and then at night there's this thick mist or fog that covers the entire land. People are afraid to go out into it because there are these supposedly dangerous creatures hiding within the fog, or the mist, more appropriately. So culturally, the people are ruled by a god king who is supposedly 1,000 years old. According to legend, he was originally a hero, and he was elevated to godhead at a place called the Well of Ascension. And this happened so that he might be able to dispel this particular evil called the Deepness. But unfortunately, this supposed hero is now the dictator, and he controls both the common citizenry and the nobility, who are the uber wealthy families. So it's a classic tale. It's boiled down, it's a classic tale of an evil despot, simple in its broad strokes, but with a complex and unique magic system that keeps me interested. In terms of media adaptation, as of right now, there are no media adaptations of this story, although I do believe that it would work either as a streaming show or an animated film or an animated series. I do know that the rights of the Cosmere series, which includes Mistborn, the Mistborn trilogy, and the Stormlight Archive series, I know that they have been on the table before, but as far as I can find on the internet right now, there is nothing set in stone. Brandon comes across to me as smart, and I imagine that he knows that a terrible media adaptation can really tarnish a franchise overnight. I'm thinking Rings of Power, I'm thinking Wheel of Time, both of which were adapted by Amazon Studios. Brandon was the literal successor of Robert Jordan and The Wheel of Time, And the fact that he was not incorporated into the Amazon interpretation of that series really tells you all you need to know about the decision makers there. You can find videos online of him giving live critique of that particular show, and he vindicated the way a lot of people feel and felt about how Amazon has tarnished the Wheel of Time series IP. And so if he's smart, I think he's going to wait on two things. I think he will wait until the Cosmere series is totally complete, which, as we know, is going to be a very long time. He's going to wait on Hollywood to change their way they currently treat fantasy IPs. I'm thinking Wheel of Time, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, I think could be included in that. Or he's going to wait until later to adapt it into an animation based on a team outside of the American entertainment spheres. Maybe someone like the Japanese or the Korean entertainment industries. And I think that it is possible that a bad adaptation, something like The Wheel of Time or Rings of Power, can rally people around the books with, a new appreciation. I read countless comments of people saying things like, watching Rings of Power makes me just want to go back and read the original or watch the originals. And so I can see how, in a way, it would help a brand. But why would Sanderson take that risk? And good on him for not jumping the gun there. So here's my generalized summary of the book. Be aware, I'm only grazing the main plot. There are multiple side stories that I don't cover here because they are better read than summarized. But for all intents and purposes, I will share the main plot points here before really diving into the lore. So the story begins with a man named Kelsier, and he is spreading dissent among the slave population and the lower class people of the world. They are called Ska, S-K-A-A. And he has this street cred because Kelsier was himself at one point imprisoned, and he was kept in an area called the Pits of Hathshin. But he has become this legendary hero, or this legendary character, because he is the only person who has ever managed to escape captivity in those mines, which is considered impossible in this world. So he is spreading dissent among the enslaved population. Meanwhile, in the city of Luthadel, because Kelsier is doing his thing at the time being out in the countryside, in the city, in Luthadel, there's a young street girl named Vin, and she is working for this criminal underlord. And he utilizes her abilities on thieving missions. And the ability that she has at the beginning of the book is something that she calls luck. She knows that she has this luck, but she's not yet aware of the nature of that luck. Turns out that she's actually an allomancer. She can use metal to create these fantastical abilities, but she doesn't know that yet. She's discovered by Kelsier, the rabble-rouser, and ends up joining his heist crew, even though she's very distrustful of all people, and it's primarily the main point of her character arc is that she is very distrusting. And she's this way because she was abandoned by her brother at some point. Now, in the meantime, the main dictator, he's called the Lord Ruler, he has this cabal of these bizarre allomantic fighters, and they're called Steel Inquisitors. And it is a Steel Inquisitor that is pictured, I believe, on the front of the original cover art, along with Vin. And they monitor the nobility and the citizens, and they keep them in line. They're known for these spikes that are driven into their eyes, and yet somehow they are able to, quote unquote, see. So in the meantime, Kelsier begins to train Vin, and he trains her to use her allomancy, and it's uncovered that, surprise, surprise, she is a Mistborn. So she is able to utilize all of the metals and all of the abilities that come with the metals, not just a single one. Now, in the world, this has implications for her lineage because those abilities, as I mentioned earlier, are genetic. And so they are carefully bred within the noble classes. So she's taught that the main metals, what they are, how to consume them. In this case, they drink them, and how to use them during these night excursions throughout the city with Cosmere. And so the main abilities that we see in this first book that she uses are strengthening her body, pushing and pulling in a telekinetic type way off of metal, and then having the ability to see when someone else is using it, using allomancy. So eventually she becomes a spy on the nobility because they throw these lavish parties where she can network and eavesdrop on what the noble houses are planning. Because Cosmere is obviously planning some sort of social unrest. But she's not really let into the inner circle at the beginning. But he wants to invest in her. And he keeps her along. She stays interested in helping him because he is the ability to helping her understand how to use allomancy. So there is this transition period where Vin has to learn how to speak like a noble, how to carry herself like a noble. And I think that is some of the more interesting parts of the book. Her alter ego has a name. The name is Valette Renew. And she ends up falling in love with this noble of the biggest and most powerful house, House of Venture. She falls in love with Eland. And, I found this relationship, there were several things about this story that I wasn't in love with, pun not intended. I found this relationship to be kind of simplistic and predictable, but I do like that Eland Venture's character, although he isn't very complex to me, I do like the way he is. And so it's got that Eliza Doolittle, Prince and the Pauper, Aladdin feel to it. You see it coming from a mile away. There's a class distinction between two characters. One of them doesn't know that they are of higher social standing than the other. They fall in love, and yet they decide to love each other anyway, even though there's this social distinction. Anyway, this obviously does cause problems because in the meantime, Cosmere has gathered an army, and he's started a house war in the upper classes through planned and strategic assassinations. Each house begins blaming the other houses, and unfortunately, near the end of the second act, Cosmere's army is destroyed. But in the meantime, he manages to also destroy the pits of Hathshin, which is where it turns out the fabled 11th metal is mined. He has been the one spreading the rumor about the 11th metal, and the reason he knows about it is because he was mining it and he escaped to tell people about it. Generally, people who go to the pits die there, and so it's a well-contained secret. But Cosmere knew that that's where the precious 11th metal was mined, and so he ends up destroying the mines for that purpose. It's unfortunate for the Empire because the noble houses pay these extravagant fees for very small doses, and the ability that it grants the user is visions of how a person will soon react to something. So if someone is fighting and you've consumed the 11th metal, you can predict and see and anticipate the way someone will move a few seconds before they actually do it. So it gives you this immediate type of foresight, which is good for conflicts. Vin finds out that Eland's father, the leader of House Venture, plans to kill him for liability reasons, and she intervenes. But the climax of the story blossoms with the economy suddenly becoming destabilized. The houses are warring, and Cosmere's crew has this showdown in the public square with the Lord Ruler. and his agents. At the end of the book, Kelsier ends up dying a martyr at the hands of the Lord Ruler, and his death lights the fuse for rebellion, which was his plan all along. So Vin discovers, meanwhile, that the Lord Ruler was never the hero of ages, but was in fact the hero's traitorous assistant who killed him and took his place. So it's a classic case of stolen identity. And it's also revealed that he was not only an allomancer, but a new type of a magical character called a feruchemist, which is the ability to store energy from your body into metals to be used at a later date. So that's the secondary magical system in the universe. We don't learn too much about it in this particular book. I suspect it's covered more in the next ones. But at the end of the day, Vin discovers that this is why the Lord Ruler has lived so long. She separates him from his feruchemical bracelets that weakens him, and then she stabs him to death. And with that, the rebellion is successful in their attempt to destroy the government and the Lord Ruler. So, that's the main plot. Now I want to get into the details of the allomancy system and the lore of this universe. The allomancy system is something I really enjoyed, even though initially I was sort of disgusted by the idea of someone consuming metal or chewing on a coin. I thought, how is that going to work? But what makes it work is that in world, it's consumed in liquid form, in vials. And that's much more palatable to me, again, pun not intended, than swallowing BBs or coins. It's a hard magic category, so the rules are explicitly explained and predictable, which works for this world. I like how each metal has its equal alloy, and they function with a sort of push and pull mechanic. So what are the specific metal abilities? These are very detailed, and you can tell that Sanderson put a lot of thought into it. And there are charts in the book that show these effects, the name of the metal, their alloy, and the effect that they have. And there are also charts on his website if you're interested in seeing the more detailed descriptions. The first metal is iron. It grants the ability to pull on nearby metals, with the steel alloy creating push. So it allows for a type of telekinesis with small metal objects like coins, but with larger objects, Vin can push or pull her entire body. And so that allows for some really cool effects, like Vin drops a coin in the air and pushes herself higher into the sky. It's very fast moving. Or she can hover. She can give the appearance of flight or levitation as she's equally balanced above or near certain metals. And so it's a constant magnetic field type of ability. So the second metal is tin, and that grants enhanced senses. So while the pewter alloy grants enhanced physical abilities, and it makes one super strong. I think it's my favorite metal in the book. So if Vin consumes that and then uses it, the verb there that they use is called burning. If Vin consumes the metal and burns that, she can fall from a great height unharmed, or she can take a hit or a punch or a stab in these superhuman ways. My favorite ability. The third metal is zinc. It soothes the emotions of a target. And the alloy there is brass. It creates a riot of emotions. So these are the more subtle effects. There's a character in the book who's part of Kelsier's crew named Breeze, and he showcases how this ability could be very dangerous. He emotionally manipulates people to desire pleasing him, so much that he often has people fetch him drinks. He's also able to rile up the emotions of the crowd and produce these riots. For example, this manipulation, it can be done individually or to a mass of people, but obviously that depends on the strength of the allomancer. The Lord Ruler, for example, is really good at this. He is able to create a wave of despair and of crowd suppression feeling by his very presence throughout the city, which shows that he not only rules through force, but also emotional manipulation. The fourth metal is copper, and that helps the user hide their allomancy, while the alloy there is bronze, and it reveals people who are using. These can function as sort of umbrellas that hide the location of bases of allomancers or their allies. And I don't know if the 9th and 10th metals are covered. If they are, so the 5th and 10th metals, I don't know if those are covered in this particular book. I don't remember much about those, but I will cover them in the review of my next book. I'm pretty sure that it will be there. So those are the basic metals used in this book. I think it's creative, and it taught me a lot about metal. So there's a plus for that. The other magical system that I mentioned in the plot, Ferukami, it's covered less, but I also found that an intriguing system. The idea being that I can store up energy into a metal, particularly a piece of jewelry, and use that energy at a later time. It's similar to allomancy, but the fuel source is the user themselves, not a consumed metal. And so it creates this drain on the body of the user. And so I'm curious to see more detail about that system in the future. I really like this idea because it prevents the user from being too godlike, which is the best route for storytelling with stakes. You know, both allomancers and feruchemists are powerful, but their abilities have to be used strategically and contextually. They're not invincible, and the magic or the abilities that they use come at a cost, which I believe is a good way to add stakes to a magical story, although it never bogs the story down or the action. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I think I failed to mention that allomancers also can become poisoned in their consumption of metal. And so I think it would be boring to have magic systems that cost so much that nobody ever uses it, which is kind of how I felt about the magic in The Witcher, at least in the TV show. But at the end of the day, I'm reading a magical fantasy, so give me that magic. Give me that action. Don't make the cost of magic too high, is what I'm saying. Because if the lore of a system demands that the magic cost is too high, you don't see it that much. And so I think a nice balance is best, and Sanderson has created a nice balanced magic system here. So overall, I have a few additional thoughts. Overall, it's a nice read. There are some very predictable plot points, but I mean, hey, there's often a reason that we read a story or watch a movie. We want those plot points. So it's a safe read. And Sanderson does a good job. He refreshes a familiar surrounding story with a new and interesting allomancy system, which makes it worth the read. The next thought I have is that there are some really cheesy moments, especially the dialogue near the end of the book from Cosmere. They kind of remind me of the scenes from the Hunger Games where you have your character that's designed to be the martyr that sparks the revolution. They're kind of cheesy, but I will say that there are also very good moments of tension toward the end, especially when Vin is navigating the upper classes and some of the conflicts she's having there and the inevitable clashes that she has. There are some very good fast-moving fight scenes involving her. And then finally, symbols placed significantly in the book, and I mean this in the literal pages of the book. Sanderson in this book, and also I noticed in the Stormlight books, has these curious shapes and symbols that symbolize each character or each piece of metal or each ability, and he has them placed throughout the books in certain chapters and in certain places. I think is a type of foreshadowing or almost like Easter eggs throughout the pages of the book. It's not obvious why they are there, but it adds this nice element of thoughtfulness to the book. So if you're looking for something different, but you don't want to keep track of too many names or plots like Game of Thrones, it's a good book. Sanderson writes well enough to keep you curious about the magic, but he also doesn't overwhelm the reader, which is characteristic of his writing style. And so I'm going to give you some predictions for the next books. And then after I read them, we will see if I was correct or not. So the first thing I predict is that Vin and Eland are going to find themselves on opposite ends of the political aisle. And that will bring about complications into their relationship. I find in the first book that they agreed on everything politically. The only difference was their class. But I think in this one, we're going to see more conflict in Paradise there. So the second prediction I have is that we will learn more about the metals, and I think even more metals beyond the 10 that are included in this one, and learn more about the other magic system and how it balances out with allomancy. I predict that the way the spikes are placed on the symbols, I predict that the way the spikes that are placed in the heads of the Inquisitors affects their abilities, because I was looking at the metal symbols on the official charts created by Sanderson, and I noticed that there are 2 spikes in different configurations on each metal. I don't know what that means, but I think that's connected. And finally, I also predict that we will learn more about the deepness, and I suspect that Vin might have opened Pandora's box when she killed the Lord Ruler. Will I be right? I don't know. We will see when I get to book 2. But in the meantime, thanks for listening. I really enjoyed Mistborn. If you're looking for something that's not too complex but has a little bit of depth, check it out. Thanks for spending time with me, and I'll see you in the next episode.